When it comes to the world of 3D printing and people who get into the hobby, there is a word that I have heard used to describe it more than any other, which is addictive. What is so addictive about smushing melted plastic into shapes and making things with it? As a serial hobbyist myself who's taken a dive down pretty much every niche and rabbit hole for every even like kind of thing that I'm interested in, 3D printing is really unique in that addictive nature. And I think if you're anybody who has had any kind of like tinkering, makery, DIY-ish sort of leanings in your past, as soon as you get a 3D printer, it just sort of unlocks all of that. As cheesy as it sounds, it really does open up a whole new world, and you just kind of want to spend as much time as possible exploring that. And so of course, when you get your 3D printer, you're going to get some accessories and tools, you're going to print some accessories and tools, you're going to spend more money than you ever expected on rolls of plastic filament, and then before you know it, you're going to buy what is one of the most common accessories for someone who gets their first 3D printer, and that is a second 3D printer. Now, if you're using 3D printing for business or school, having multiple printers makes a ton of sense. So what I'm focusing on here is mostly like the home hobbyist 3D printer, where you could have anywhere from 0 to question mark number of 3D printers, and it's kind of entirely up to you. So what I want to talk about today is why so many people have 2 3D printers, what the purpose is for that, but I also want to kind of keep one foot in both worlds and basically use this to validate any feelings you're having if you're thinking of getting a second 3D printer, to let you know that that's not a crazy thing to do. Anecdotally, every person I know in my own life who's gotten a 3D printer has gotten at least a second 3D printer, if not more. I was thinking about it this morning before recording this, and I don't think I personally know anybody who only has one 3D printer. It's either 0 or at least 2. But at the same time, if you're someone who has your first 3D printer or you're thinking of getting it and you kind of feel overwhelmed by the world of print farms and people with multiple printers surrounding them, I also want to validate that it is completely okay to not get a second 3D printer, and it's something that might not fit for you or might not be a good fit for you right now. So if you're anything like me, probably the biggest reason for getting a second 3D printer is the simple fact that you can't print while you're printing. And as fun and addicting as it is to find designs, make designs, print them, put things together, sometimes you find yourself clicking print and then the printer's like, okay, 14 hours remaining. And you're like, well, that was my printing for the day. Yay. So adding a second printer then lets you print while you're printing, and that can then be a very efficient workflow. So I think probably for most people, that's the reason, is you have a printer and you want to just print while you're printing, have them both going at the same time. I don't follow this rule like the law of nature or anything, but personally I try to have one printer that kind of does like longer projects and then another printer that sort of does like the shorter parts. So maybe this one is doing things that take 1 to 2 hours, while this one is printing stuff that might take, 10 to 15 hours. And getting a second 3D printer can be a really fun experience, but it can also be kind of overwhelming. So it sort of depends on the route that you take. A lot of people will just get the same or similar to what they already have because you already know it and everything just kind of is uniform, and that really works nicely. I mentioned being a serial hobbyist a moment ago, and something that I think is pretty unique to 3D printing compared to some of my other hobbies is that it's tough to outgrow your 3D printers. So you can have a basic printer and then you can upgrade to a more advanced printer. You can add a more advanced printer to your workflow, but your original printer isn't suddenly out of date or obsolete. It can still work right alongside your newer, bigger, or more advanced printer. And I think that's really different to some of my other hobbies, like cameras, for example, where you might start out with a budget-friendly camera, you upgrade to a nicer model, and you usually don't want to go back and use the one that's not going to give you as good results. Whereas with 3D printers, especially anything that's relatively modern, like if you get a Bamboo A1 Mini and then you decide to upgrade to the P2S or the X2D, your A1 Mini is still going to produce prints that in terms of overall quality are the same as the other printers. So everything kind of plays together really, really well. And then you can have your big printer printing big things, your little printer printing little things, and it's just sort of this happy ecosystem. There's also something that happens when you get into 3D printing where the simplicity can sometimes be a bit deceptive. If you go to, websites and you start shopping for printers, you'll see a lot of product photos where it's like a printer on a desk in a workspace, and it's all very neat and organized, and there's just kind of like one printer. It almost looks like this, right? Like you just have a printer on a thing and that's it. This printer is not plugged in right now, right? I put it here for the video. This one is plugged in, but I wheeled it in from over there. when you actually get a 3D printer, you need other stuff for the printer. At the very least, you need filament for it. You probably have some tools. You probably have some other accessories. You need a stand or a desk. You kind of usually will end up with a little workspace for your printer. And more often than not, that workspace will be a little bit bigger and take up a little more space than you might have expected when you first got your printer, even if you just started out with a tiny printer. So what that means, fortunately, if you're thinking of getting a second printer, is that adding a second printer usually doesn't, depends on the printer, but it usually doesn't expand or overwhelm your existing space too much. Once you've already got things kind of set up for one printer, adding a second one, you don't need to rebuy all your filament. You don't need to rebuy every tool and every accessory. A lot of stuff just carries over between your two printers. And so in a weird way, adding a second printer kind of balances out your setup, because this setup that started for one printer kind of grew into like a big makerspace, sometimes ends up with a little empty space over here. Boop, you just fill that with a second printer and then you're good to go. And of course, that's a very general example, but what I have found just in my own experience and experience of others is that you get your first printer, it ends up taking more space than you expect. You get a second printer and it ends up kind of adding less stuff than you would have expected for a second printer. It's not just like copy paste the first setup. But of course, there's a lot more beyond just wanting to print while you print. Different printers have different features. You know, the P2S is a single nozzle printer without an actively heated chamber, while the X2D over here is a dual nozzle printer with an actively heated chamber. So if I want to print stuff with more complex supports, if I want to print materials that require like very specific internal temperatures of the printer, this lets me do things that this printer can't do. The printer that I also have that is too big to just easily move in here is the H2C, which is giant and it has multiple nozzles. So if I want to use a lot of different colors, a lot of different materials, it has a bigger build plate, a bigger build volume. It can do things that neither of these printers can do. Then I use that printer. So there's definitely an argument to be made for adding a second printer to bring in new features and new capabilities that your first printer doesn't have. And then again, like I mentioned, they can still complement each other. It doesn't have to totally replace that first printer. So if you've got one 3D printer and you're thinking of adding a second, I promise that is not a crazy thought. It's not unreasonable. It's not ridiculous. In a lot of cases, it's actually a very practical thing. But something to avoid, especially if you're just diving into the hobby and you're new to it, is, as addicting and fun as it is, you kind of want to avoid that initial like 3D dopamine rush, 3D printing dopamine rush that you get just because it is so fun and it is so exciting. And I speak from personal experience because I got my first 3D printer in October of 2016. By January of 2017, I had 3 3D printers. And by June of 2017, I had 6 3D printers. And mine were mostly monoprice printers because they were really affordable. I don't even think Monoprice makes 3D printers anymore, but they're pretty affordable and they had some cool features and cool designs. Like there was a Delta printer that was really, really cool. And then I did get a Prusa MK2S, and then eventually I got my Prusa Mini when that was released as well. And it seemed kind of cool to have all these printers and it was really fun, but then it became totally overwhelming. It ended up totally being the cliche of the things you own end up owning you, because I spent most of my time tinkering with my printers and not in a fun way. I was doing all kinds of bed leveling and calibration and troubleshooting and rebuilding, and it was just like not that fun. And so I ended up giving away all of my printers except for my very first one for sentimental reasons, which I have a whole video about comparing it to this printer for no reason other than that I thought it would be fun, and my Prusa Mini, which despite some issues does still work, and it's just a cool small little printer that it doesn't take up a lot of space to just kind of keep this around. And eventually, after about 6 years, when it started having issues, that's when I needed to upgrade and I got my P2S now almost a year ago. And when I got into the world, this is when I want to shift to the person who's like hesitant of, I don't know if I actually want to deal with multiple printers. Is that something you have to do? When I got my P2S, I was pretty adamant about not getting a second printer. I do now have 3 3D printers, so asterisk there. What I ended up doing was getting a second AMS unit for this, and that was a really cool upgrade. And the reason I didn't want a second printer was I didn't want to go into that overwhelm of maintenance and, you know, the printers are kind of big, they take up space. I just kind of didn't want to deal with that. I wanted to sort of master this. And because I'm in the weird situation of having a YouTube channel, I was fortunate enough that Bamboo reached out and offered to send the H2C not long after I got this printer. And I actually said no for several months because as nice as that was, I felt like I didn't know enough about this printer. I was definitely not ready to dedicate the space or the mental energy to a second printer. I just didn't want to get caught up in that world of having too many printers, which I know sounds like a first world problem, but it can really sometimes take the fun out of the hobby. Anything that's going to add fun to your hobby is a good thing. Anything that's going to take fun away from it, probably something to avoid. As time went on and I started learning more about my P2S and I got more comfortable with it, and then I started having questions about what does the H2C do? Would that be a cool thing to see? And then I started running into the issue of wanting to print while I'm printing. That was really kind of the bottleneck. And then at that point I was like, okay, I'll check out the H2C. Bamboo was nice enough to send that over, and I checked that out. And then when the X2D was released, they sent that over. So I've limited myself to 3 3D printers, which unfortunately does not mean I can print in 9D. And that's because I have the space to keep 1 printer in here in my office, and I can keep 2 printers in an extra bedroom, and everything kind of, that just works really well without actually being really intrusive at all. It doesn't take up that much more space than just having the original P2S did. And that's also about as much as I can just handle mentally, is dealing with and figuring out and remembering all the details between 3 different models of 3D printers. If other things show up, like Bamboo also sent out the A2L when that was released, which is super cool, then I can find places. I found a middle school to donate that to, so that way the printer can show up, I can test it out, I can try it out, and then it can move on to somewhere else where it will be used and appreciated and help other people enjoy 3D printing as well. So it's kind of different for everybody. If you have a very small 1-bedroom apartment, making room for 1 3D printer, even something like the P2S, might be a lot, because it's not a tiny printer. If you're in a situation like me, you've got an office or a spare bedroom, maybe you could have 2 or 3 printers. If you're somebody who has a workshop and a garage, you could have your own personal print farm. So it is very important to know what your specific needs are, what your kind of limits are, what your own personal boundaries are, versus just what you see other people doing. If you see someone that has multiple printers, if you see someone that only has 1 printer, if you see someone that has a whole print farm, that doesn't mean that's gonna be what suits you the best. Especially as a home hobbyist 3D printer, I think the most important thing to do is to keep the hobby fun. And so whatever that is for you, if that's just 1 simple printer that you enjoy using, you should just use that 1 simple printer. If that's expanding your setup and adding multiple printers, and that's what's gonna keep things fun, and it's something you can do safely within your budget, then that's absolutely something you should do. And a really cool thing to keep in mind is the same way that a 3D printer rarely becomes totally obsolete. Like, even if you have a printer with newer features, an older printer will still work. There is the 3D printing hand-me-down pipeline. So the same way that if Bamboo sends a printer, I can donate it somewhere where it's going to be used. If you say you only have room for 2 printers, you get something like the A1 Mini, and then you get an X2D, and then you decide, oh, maybe I'll get a P2S to go along with the X2D, but you don't have room for those plus the A1 Mini. Most of us probably have friends or relatives who are at least a little bit curious about 3D printing, and then now your first 3D printer, your original 3D printer, can go to them and help them get interested in the hobby as well, and they're gonna have a great time with it. It's not like you're giving them an outdated piece of 1970s technology or something. An older 3D printer, even if it has fewer features and less capabilities, is still capable of pulling someone into the hobby and letting them have a ton of fun. And in the same vein of not being overwhelmed by 3D printing, if you wanna know some of the useful things you actually need to get started 3D printing, I do have a separate video all about that right here.